Pivot to Peace is a Chinese-American organization which is trying to address the Cold War, the new Cold War that has been brewing for the last few years, at least during the Trump administration. It recommenced when Obama called for a pivot to Asia. And that's when things started to go pear-shaped in particular. And now basically almost everything that China does, everything, is seen, and anything that Chinese organizations do is looked upon with suspicion. And, we've returned to some ridiculous vilification of Asians. It's not just Chinese people. And I'm going to share with you part of a webinar by Pivot to Peace, which is these Chinese Americans who, from all walks of life, they're trying to address and stop this new Cold War, which could lead to a hot war, which would be basically the end of life on Earth, because China has nuclear weapons, and it's not going to just roll over and let the US empire basically take over. I mean, the US empire sees China as an economic threat. China is basically overtaking the US as one of the greatest economies on the planet today, or the greatest economy, and that is verboten for the US empire, because capitalism for the US empire is fine as long as they are the one that is dictating the terms to everybody else. When another country becomes some kind of what they see as a threat, I mean, capitalism is supposed to be about competition. Of course, it's inherently exploitative. It also is inextricably linked to imperialism, as we see all around the world with US empire. And it leads to fascism, which we see is what is going on right now in the US. Let's hope that he was ousted by voters. This is, and I think that he was, this has been a little taste of, overt fascism. And of course, as I've mentioned before, I don't want to get off track with this, but as I mentioned before, if the Democratic Party doesn't become an alternative, and if there isn't ranked choice voting, if there isn't paper ballots, if there isn't international oversight, if the voter suppression ends, if all the other shenanigans that go on in these elections on both sides, of both major parties, if all of this doesn't end, and if there isn't the ability for third parties to get on the ballot and remain on the ballot and not have to jump through hoops and then end up being tossed off like the Democratic Party did with the Green Party this election, all of that, if there isn't any real fourth estate, something that is not owned by corporations, then there's no chance that anything is going to change. There's no chance that anybody is going to have anything that they deserve. The public is not going to get what they deserve, and therefore that will mean another fascist will get into office, because there is no real alternative to basically the GOP. There is no real alternative to that. So a competent fascist is going to come along in 2024, and if nothing has changed in these 4 years, which I doubt very much anything was going to change, even if Joe Biden has said nothing is going to fundamentally change, and look how he's laden his cabinet with Republicans basically, and full-on conservatives, warmongers, etc. I don't think anything's going to change. So look out 2024 when we are presented with people that are much worse than Trump and are competent and are eloquent, etc. Okay, so I digress. And what I mean by this rather bleak description of the next 4 years is that I do not see that the Democratic Party or the GOP are going to pull back on their war, their saber-rattling with China, and I see that is going to just keep on progressing until there's a real possibility of a hot war, and then that could be mutually assured destruction, because Russia will probably come to the defense of China, because Russia is on the chopping block too. The US wants a unipolar world. It doesn't want a multipolar world, and unfortunately, that's what's going to happen. The US either accepts that there is the beginnings of a multipolar world, or it decides we don't accept that, and it decides to basically try and do the most riskiest behavior and crush any country who is part of that multipolar world, being Russia and China in particular, Venezuela, Bolivia, Iran, that kind of thing. I don't see the US deciding to play ball to end this warmongering. I don't see it at all. And the thing is, the US empire has basically spread itself so thin. It's very similar to the Roman Empire toward the end, where it was picking fights with people that it couldn't win, basically. And it had so many extensions, military, micro-military things going on all over the world, that it was impossible to really keep it going. And then you get the Praetorian Guard was choosing the emperors and knocking them off if they weren't suitable. Well, you could say the CIA or the U.S. U.S. national security state is like the Praetorian Guard, deciding who eventually is going to be the leader of the empire, the puppet of the empire. So Pivot to Peace, basically, this excerpt I'm going to play, it really makes me sad. I sort of feel, it makes me feel really kind of almost teary, because it's a bit like someone sort of, it's a bit like, I'm not saying these people are like children or anything, but it reminds me of somebody who is sort of begging for another person, a bully, not to hit them and not to kill them almost. And that bully is a psychopath and has no empathy whatsoever, and it's useless appealing to their empathy or any sense of justice. They're just going to go ahead and kill that person. And this is sort of what makes me sad, is because I see these people, totally innocent people, Chinese Americans, who are basically being vilified now, could end up being rounded up like the Japanese were in World War II and put in detention camps. I can see this is going to be an opportunity for corporations to be able to, pillage and take over Chinese establishments, Chinese businesses. This could really be a horrendous situation for Chinese Americans, not to mention, of course, the 1 billion or so Chinese who are just minding their own business in China. And when you see the US is a failed state, basically it is. I mean, it's got people drinking poisoned water. They've abandoned the public, the duopoly, in a pandemic. They can't even give them Medicare for all in a pandemic. Basically, there's a gazillion things that are wrong. And it's a failed state, the US. Whereas China, and China has its problems, it most certainly does, but one of the good things that China has done is it has pulled 800 million people out of poverty. 800 million. And that's something pretty awesome, really, for a country to be able to do that. The US has a third of that population, well, less than a third of that population, and they have like 50 people who have more wealth than half of the country. And there are huge amounts of poverty now in the US. Read America, the Farewell Tour by Chris Hedges. There's a tremendous amount of suffering and people killing themselves because they can't cope with it anymore. All sorts of awful things that this failed state, the US, is displaying for everybody to see, and yet keeps on telling everybody that it's the greatest country in the world. That's the politicians, the oligarchs, all claiming that the US is the most wonderful country on earth. I invite you to really support Pivot to Peace. I'll leave a link to the different social media platforms they have. I was surprised to see there's only 9 subscribers on their new channel. They had an older channel, and for some reason you can't click the notifications bell. I don't know why. I couldn't click it anyway. And they seem to have started a new channel. So it's only got 9 subscribers, so I'll leave a link to both of them, and you can join both of them if you can. Maybe they started the new channel because there's something wrong with the notifications bell. I don't know. So anyway, I'll play this, and please support in any way you can, in non-violent ways. Push against this burgeoning, it's a Cold War right now, and it's heading towards a hot war, and that will involve Russia, and it will be nuclear, and that means mutually assured destruction. Stay tuned.
Peace Pivot is a newly formed grassroots organization of Americans who have joined hands to oppose the new Cold War. We are a rainbow coalition of Asians, Blacks, Latinos, Muslims, whites, and immigrants across the United States. We have a very strong commitment to fight against the US new Cold War policies that may end up in military confrontation. These Cold War policies are counterproductive and have dire consequences for ordinary US citizens and the world community. The unique aspect of Pivot to Peace is the large contingent of Chinese Americans in the core group and as sponsors of the organization. Chinese Americans feel betrayed by our American government in this Cold War. The FBI Chief Christopher Wray declared all Chinese in America are potential spies under the whole of society theory. As a result, over 100 Chinese American scientists, are being persecuted for minor process crimes and another 1,000 under investigation for espionage economic crimes. A Chinese American businessman in San Francisco was harassed by the FBI office for selling some audio equipment to the Chinese consulate office. And the latest is nonprofit community agencies that associate with China, such as the US-China Friendship Association that has been around for 40 years, are specifically called out for suspicion of carrying out espionage campaigns against the United States. That kind of tactics towards Americans who happen to like China and enjoy association with the Chinese people and not necessary for political reasons are oppressive and chilling and a violation of the civil and political rights. In February of this year, the Chinese community organized a huge demonstration in San Francisco to fight racism and support China in its fight against COVID-19. At that demonstration, 1,000 people, mainly Chinese Americans, showed up. We marched through the streets of San Francisco and we gave local and international media coverage. By the way, of all the major cities in the United States, San Francisco is the city with the lowest death rates from COVID-19. Why? I think because we started wearing masks early on, something we learned from China in its handling of the pandemic. But after the pandemic hit the United States, we were not able to take it to the streets anymore. So we joined Pivot to Peace and started organizing peace efforts with a broad-based group of individuals who love humanity and our country, the United States of America. What we need very desperately is the opportunity to level the playing field against the biased one-sided opinions that dominate American mainstream media and challenge the censorships. Recently, PBS pulled a documentary about China's poverty alleviation program, not for any reason except it shows a very humane story of poor people in villages being helped by Chinese cadres. And Netflix is being pressured by a group of right-wing US senators to cancel the production of a fantasy movie written by a Chinese writer by the name of Liu Xiyan because she had made some comments about Xinjiang that was not politically correct to them. The powers converge between the United States politicians and the mainstream media so that the public can hear only one side of the story. Is that democratic? But it's also very dangerous because the people are being persuaded and we need to really occupy a larger space in that corner. Now, in the 6 months since Pivot to Peace was formed, we have produced 2 informative webinars to educate the American public about the Cold War. The first webinar was viewed by 15,000 people. It is very small compared to the 1 million people who read the New York Times. But still, we're making a small dent. But if more of us do webinars or contribute stories about the benefits of US-China cooperation in social media, our aggregate efforts may help spread the message more. Our second webinar is still being shared, so please go to our website and view it. We've also prepared Chinese subtitles, so non-English speaking Chinese people can view it. This fall, we are planning 2 more short webinars with a focus on how the US can benefit from working cooperatively with China, especially on the environment. Maybe at some point we'll get to the 1 million number, but for now, let's just make sure the mainstream media is not the only voice in this war, that our voice counts too. We could do it if we stand together to push back on US hegemony, xenophobia, and demand peace. We need to keep submitting editorials, letters, and yes, they throw them away. They never print them, but they get to read them. And I think our voice will hopefully make a difference. Thank you so much for joining this webinar.
Judge Lillian Singh, you are the first Asian American female judge in Northern California. You are a passionate advocate of justice and civil rights. And in 2015, you retired as a judge to install the Comfort Women Memorial in San Francisco. And you are currently the co-chair of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition. We understand that as an attorney, before you became a judge, you presented Chinese in the US who have been victims of the McCarthy era. Now that McCarthyism is again rearing its ugly head, can you comment on that and how should Chinese Americans deal with this as a group now? And also, as I'm sure you've seen, a recent poll shows that a large number of Americans, after years of China bashing in the media and by the Trump administration, have a highly unfavorable view towards China. How does this impact the way Chinese Americans are being viewed?
Thank you, Sheila. That's a lot for me to speak in 5 to 7 minutes, but I'll try. I'd like to follow up on Professor Lin Chi-Wang's theme on how foreign policies dictate domestic consequences and guilt by association. It was during the Cold War, the first Cold War, that McCarthyism first raised its ugly head. Senator Joseph McCarthy was obsessed with hunting down communist sympathizers. At that time, the foreign policy was America and communist Russia were enemies. And by definition, anything communism is a threat to United States security. Chinese is a communist country, and therefore China became United States' #1 enemy. So anything connected with China is considered dangerous. Of course, most Chinese Americans have families in China, have relatives and friends in China. So guilt by association made Chinese Americans as potential enemies of this country. FBI would raid Chinese homes without notice. And there was a social club called Ningxing. It means youth citizens, where kids 13, 14 would get together to learn English, Chinese, and American arts and culture, including singing Chinese songs. That was considered suspicious. The FBI raided the club and arrested many of them. Some of them lost their citizenships and their passports. In the 70s, they became my clients. Some of them became my clients. I helped them restore their citizenships, but I could never restore the pain that they went through and the indignities that they suffered. I think it impacted their lives forever. Now, we are again facing a new Cold War. And this time, again, the foreign policies is dictating our domestic consequences. On February 2018, the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, issued a dire warning. The whole of Chinese society is a threat to the United States, and Americans must step up to defend themselves. In ordinary parlance, it means all persons of Chinese American descent in our whole society are to be distrusted and be regarded as potential spies. And all Americans must defend themselves against Chinese Americans. It is a we-they attitude. All Chinese Americans are potential enemies of we Americans in America, in every aspect of American society, whether it's in business, science, medicine, politics, academia, or government. That is extremely dangerous for us Chinese Americans. About 2 months ago, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued warnings for people associated with two civic, nonprofit, community-based organizations called U.S. Friendship Association and Chinese Council for the Peaceful Reunification of Taiwan as being controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. By implications, these two organizations and their members throughout the United States are in fact considered as agents and tools of the Chinese Communist Party, representing the interests of China rather than the interests of the United States, which renders them susceptible to charges of espionage and treason. Like the Ningxing Club that I just mentioned, this again is guilt by association. All the members of the U.S.-China Friendship Association and Chinese Council for Peaceful Reunification of Taiwan are now deemed guilty by association with their affiliation with their love for China, wanting to learn culture and establish friendship and reunification with China, which, by the way, is official position of U.S. policy. I'll go to that later. But I want to emphasize another article that recently came up, which is an article in the Newsweek magazine that was published on October 26, 2020. Newsweek printed a long cover story linking 600 U.S. Chinese groups to Chinese Communist Party influence. This cover story seems to even outdo what McCarthyism did in the 1950s. Just like the McCarthy era and communism, just like the McCarthy era, the article basically repeated the theme that China and communism go together. And China is the enemy, and anyone who has any connection with China is a suspect and a potential spy. Again, it is guilt by association. It named over 600 groups with links to China, Chinese government, and the Chinese Communist Party. This not only included social clubs and organizations in American society, universities and colleges and public schools, but surprisingly, some of the most prestigious elite Chinese Americans who belong to the Committee of 100 were also named. This is incredible. We really live in dangerous times. We Chinese Americans are deemed guilty by our mere association with China, which of course is prohibited by the US Constitution. The US Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1965 specifically deemed it unconstitutional to single out anyone because of our national origin and race. Our national origin, a lot of us were born in China, a lot of us were born in the United States, but regardless, because of our race, our complexion, we're deemed as suspects. You know, I'm proud to be American who loves America and the country of my ancestor, China. There's nothing un-American about loving China. It is pro-America and not un-America to want to build a better relationship between the United States and China and to continue to enhance US-China friendship. What is wrong with promoting US-China friendship? Isn't that the official position of America after the Shanghai Communique? Yes, that is still the official position of the United States foreign policy towards China. This is what President Nixon did in 1972 when he issued the Shanghai Communique. He said it was in the interest of all nations for the United States and China to work together towards the normalization of their relationships. President Jimmy Carter, on December 1978, announced official One China policy between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It ended US official recognition of Taiwan. This is still our official US policy towards China. And you know what? I'm proud to say that Judge Julie Tang and I are very comfortable in working on these missions. I was chosen to represent the Chinese community and welcoming the ping pong players in the 1970s when we called the ping pong diplomacy that helped and was a key turning point in improving US-China relationships. Last year, 2019, the United States and China celebrated its 40th anniversary of the normalization of the US-China relationship. My good friend Judge Julie Tang was MC in that celebration. I was a keynote speaker. We are proud to talk about the 40 years of the win-win policy for both the United States and China. Both countries profited in the economic boom of the normalization and friendship between the United States and China. You know, we are not being disloyal to the United States because of that. There is nothing dangerous or suspicious of what we do. We Chinese Americans are actually in the best situation to educate the public, to tell the American people about why we Chinese Americans believe and why all Americans should believe that it is in the best interest of America to have a better relationship with China. So I refuse to allow people like Mr. Pompeo, Christopher Wray control my narrative as to what Chinese Americans are, who we are, and what we're allowed to do. McCarthyism must never allow to, again, rise its ugly head in our community. It is rising, but this time we are going to stamp it out. We are going to be the proactive narrator of what the truth of US-China relationship is. And this is why I'm so proud to speak in this forum with esteemed American patriots like Professor Ling Chi-Wang, Judge Julie Tang, Henry Durr, and George Koo. We are Americans of Chinese origin, but we are very loyal to the United States. Thank you.